Welcome back, everybody, to the second seminar of this fall series. We are honored to have with us Beth Rose Middleton with the talk Opportunities for Indigenous Land Restitution and Restoration through Conservation Law, Policy, and Practice. And Leke Hutchins, who's a PhD student in the Gillespie Lab, will introduce today's speaker.
Hi, everyone. So yes, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Beth Rose Middleton Manning. She is a professor and department chair of Native American Studies at UC Davis. Beth Rose's research centers on Native environmental policy and Native activism for site protection using conservation tools. Her broader research interests include intergenerational trauma and healing, rural environmental justice, Indigenous analysis of climate change, Afro-Indigeneity, and qualitative GIS. She has published numerous journal articles on these interests in journals such as Journal of Political Ecology, Ethnohistory, and Human Geography. Beth Rose received her BA in Nature and Culture from UC Davis and her PhD in Environmental Science, Policy, and Management from UC Berkeley, right here in ESPM. And while at Berkeley, she was advised by Louise Fortman. Her first book, Trust in the Land, New Directions in Tribal Conservation, focuses on Native applications of conservation easements with an emphasis on conservation partnerships led by California Native nations. Her second book, Upstream, Trust Lands and Power on the Feather River, focuses on the history of Indian land rights and hydroelectric development in Northeastern California. I should also mention that Beth will be participating in, I'm gonna share the link. In a forum on campus that starts tomorrow, actually. It's called the UC Land Grab Forum, and it's being planned by our very own Rosalie Fanchel, who's a second-year PhD student here in ESPM. And the two-part forum examines the 150,000 acres of indigenous land that funded the University of California, how this expropriation is intricately tied to California's unique history of Native dispossession and genocide, and how UC continues to benefit from this wealth accumulation today. The forum will then explore current university initiatives with tribes and engage in a community dialogue on actions the University of California can take to address the responsibility to California Indigenous communities. So part one starts tomorrow. It's from 9 to 12. And the link to the YouTube streaming link is in the chat. And I will also share the link to the forum itself. But without further ado, here's Dr. Middleton.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Really happy to be here with you all and to share on this topic today. And it's particularly exciting for me because I am an ESPM grad, and so I do remember attending these colloquia when I was a student. So it's a real honor to be here with you all. So today I'm going to be talking about a variety of areas in which I work under the umbrella of opportunities for Indigenous land restitution and restoration through conservation law, policy, and practice. I did, of course, as I mentioned, graduate from ESPM and in society and environment. So my emphasis is really on the policy and legal side, but I do collaborate with folks on the biophysical side as well. So I always start here to remind us that we are within a mosaic of Indigenous homelands and that all of the Americas is Indigenous land. And the conservation projects we work on, the restoration we do, is all within Indigenous homelands, areas held sacred to people, areas with very specific management strategies that have been honed over time. California itself is very diverse, many Native nations within what is now the state of California. But as you can see on the right, very few lands are recognized as under tribal jurisdiction, which makes it difficult to exercise traditional stewardship for many nations in California. I should say too, I'm happy to take questions as I go, but I'm not monitoring the chat that closely, but if you do have a question, please let me know. So I confront my work in the context of the colonial legacies that we live within. I grew up in Northern California and became aware pretty early on of the history of disruption of Indian land tenure, which takes many forms: the breaking of treaties over time in California specifically, as well as throughout the Americas and throughout the United States in particular, for talking about federal Indian law. The concept of encroachment, by which settlers just moved onto tribal land and then established it as their own. Allotment or division of tribal lands. The violence associated with taking lands. Government policies that facilitated and demanded removal and redistribution, including in California, which we'll talk more about tomorrow. And Indian land tenure, of course, is more than just the land itself. It's a relationship, and it's a set of responsibilities to take care of place. It's who you are. These are things that I have learned through collaborating with different practitioners over time. And there is continued denial of Indigenous rights and responsibilities to tend to homelands by many partners, many parties, federal and state agencies, private companies, timber companies, hydropower companies, private landowners, particularly large ranchers. We'll be talking more about the history of California land tomorrow, but the ways in which lands were transferred and titles dissolved that still have ramifications today. And this is not only about land rights, but about the concept of responsibility to take care of land and the ways in which people are still criminalized for doing what they need to do to take care of their homelands. Oops. So what is decolonization, and is it even possible? This word gets thrown around a lot, so I like to be really careful with how I use it. It's about unsettling the concept of settler colonialism, that people can move to a place, establish themselves there, and they make it seem like nobody was there before, that it was an empty slate before. And there's a good text I use a lot that I think does a great job of contrasting settler histories to California Native histories and knowledge of place is William Bower's California Through Native Eyes. The concept of decolonization addresses how Indigenous knowledge, histories, awareness of responsibility to place, legal structures that relate to right conduct and relationship between yourself and where you live and all of the different beings there, how those have been erased or buried and settler structures have been naturalized and accepted. So I draw on Tuck and Yang, imperfect as it is in some ways, but they say decolonization in the settler colonial context must involve repatriation or return of land. So what does that mean? And can conservation law, policy, and practice move us towards that? Or is it impossible to really even talk about decolonization, that this huge paradigm shift, while at the same time talking about conservation law and policy? So these are some of the areas that I look at. Senate Bill 18 and AB 52. AB 52 modifies the California Environmental Quality Act. Senate Bill 18 I'll talk about later, but it establishes that tribes, and not only federally recognized tribes, can hold conservation easements in California. The whole concept of easements, conservation easements, is enabled by the Uniform Conservation Easement Act. I also look at a variety of environmental protection statutes, and these initials and numbers after the bullet point refer to like an article that I published talking about some of these issues. I just dropped these in just now, and I can provide some resources if there's interest. I also look at conservation policies, so opportunities for intervention, for insertion of tribal values and goals, opportunities for land stewardship in hydropower relicensing and in carbon offsets, and then conservation practice, which I'll talk about first, where we can actually do things on the land and potentially transfer land, but that's more of the topic for tomorrow. So starting with practice, some of the tools I've been looking at include co-management agreements, memorandums of understanding, enabling different roles for tribes or tribal organizations and agencies or conservation organizations in terms of taking care of or restoring land. Easements, conservation easements, which I'll talk more about. Stewardship contracts or agreements, which are typically on national forest land. For example, like the Maidu Stewardship Project was one of the first stewardship contracts, if not the first, to a non-federally recognized tribe on the Plumas National Forest. I believe Ron Good in the Southern Sierra has recently signed a stewardship contract or agreement for some work on the National Forest down there. I'll also talk a little bit about education partnerships, which I think really lay the foundation for expanding the policy opportunities and tools for co-management and stewardship. And collaborative research is also very important. And I know folks in ESPM, such as Scott Stevens and others, are deeply involved in collaborative work with tribes around restoration and land stewardship. Lynn Hunsinger also. So some of the restoration work that we've been engaged in has to do with looking at the history of damaging practices. So really those associated with colonial history, fire suppression, denial of indigenous stewardship, overgrazing, management for single species on forest lands. And then what are ways we can restore the land that cultivate climate resilience, knowing that climates are changing, that things are getting hotter and drier, and other things are changing, increasing storms, et cetera. And then management for ecosystem services in a multifaceted view. So not only for humans, but also for other elements of the ecosystem. So these are just, some examples of some of the work I do with my students and in partnership with Natural Resources Conservation Service and Intertribal Agricultural Council, which is a wonderful partner. Students have been collaborating with different tribes, going out and gathering seed from culturally important plants that tribal members would like to bring back on landscapes that are returning to their stewardship or over which they have some type of co-management agreement. And the students then, if they don't already know, learn how to cultivate the plants from seed, working with our partners in the Arboretum. And then these are some pictures of when we went out and planted elderberry, yarrow, and some other plants out here in Tasmamkoyam or Humbug Valley. You can see the stream is down cut here. There's a field day coming up actually this weekend with multiple partners, including some of our students working on beaver dam analogs with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and others. So lots of partners collaborating in this tribally led restoration project. And these are the types of projects we try to collaborate with tribes on and look at what needs are, where students can contribute, and also what would be beneficial for students to learn so that they can continue to work in this field. And this particular student here, Ellen, she is Nomlaki, and so she's California Native. So it meant a lot to her to be able to contribute to California Native projects, both with her tribe and with other nations. And this is me doing some planting with some of the other plants that we were able to grow out, that the students were able to grow out in the Arboretum. So fire suppression is a very important topic right now. The active exclusion of indigenous land stewardship, of traditional burning, has contributed to increasing risk of catastrophic fire. There's now just a huge array of literature and testimony, academic and practitioner science that discusses the effectiveness of cultural burning in multiple ways, increasing habitat, diverse habitat, raising the water table, improving overall ecosystem health, reducing the risk of catastrophic fire, and just the cultural importance of bringing back traditional burning. Here are just a few papers. I do not study, what happens to the land after a burn. I'm really interested in the policy aspects. So what are opportunities to open more space for traditional burning, for culturally led burning, for collaborations between tribes and agencies, tribes and conservation entities to reinstitute this practice on the land. And there's great work by Don Hankins, Frank Lake, Jonathan Long, and others, Chris Adlam, looking at the outcomes on the land from cultural burning. But what I've been doing is developing this course called Keepers of the Flame. It's a field course. it really takes a lot of time to build, collaboration, funding, and partnerships, but it emphasizes hands-on learning, the recognition of Indigenous expertise, cultural knowledge around fire, and reciprocity, ways students can, and I can contribute to projects, can make sure collaborators are supported for their time. And it's been a real powerful learning experience, I think, for the students, and it's been helpful on some of the Indigenous-led projects to expand the amount of work that they've been able to do on the land. And these are just some images from our class going back a few years, working with Ron Good, burning elderberry and sourberry basketry plants. This is on private land, so the context itself is interesting. I mean, you know, the fire burned exactly as he had predicted it would, and just the fire behavior he described. But this is on his family land. It's not on public land. So there's a little more flexibility to implement some of these different strategies. It's one of our students. And this is just last year with weavers, Dunlop Mono, tribal members harvesting some of the basketry materials that benefited from the burning over the last few years. So that was really fulfilling. So each section I offer a quick summary of conservation practice, how I see this contributing to restitution and restoration. So for the education piece, the hands-on learning on Indigenous-led projects has been really positive. We hope to continue it. From my perspective, the policy questions, I'm really interested in what are the barriers to the development and expansion of tribally led projects, and or more broadly, the application of traditional methods for land restoration. And then what are the opportunities, where are there openings for co-management, and where might we push on policy levers to expand those opportunities. And then I didn't really talk about land return, but we're going to talk about that tomorrow. But, you know, consistent with thinking about where you can do these restoration projects, like for example, in Tasmamkoyam, Maidu Summit land, that land was just transferred to the summit from PG&E, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. So that opens up the opportunity to do work on that land within the Maidu homeland that wasn't there before. So how can that sort of expansion be increased? And then there are lots of opportunities for analysis, looking at the impacts both ecologically and socially, and then as well as assessing the barriers and opportunities to transcend them. So from a legal perspective, there's so many different things to talk about in terms of thinking about expanding native land stewardship, access, protection, ownership under conservation law. And these are just a few. And I will talk mostly about conservation easements pertaining to land trusts and the use of Senate Bill 18 in California. But we recently were able to use NHPA and some other laws to help stop site desecration and fire suppression activities. So I don't always write about this work, but it's really exciting just in the moment to see how these different laws, as problematic as they are from a sort of colonial perspective and roots, how they can be used to support Indigenous-led restoration, or at least site protection. So this was my first book, Trust in the Land, and really it's just about the tools available. And not that many tribes at that time were utilizing land trusts as nonprofit organizations that focus on land conservation. It is a tool to acquire land that will be for stewardship and conservation. Land trusts, I always distinguish, are different from tribal trust land. Lands are held in trust for tribes or for individual Indian people in the form of allotments or individual trust lands by the federal government. That's a different structure than a land trust, which is a nonprofit organization, could be under state or tribal law, but with a goal of holding and stewarding land to protect it. And there's a whole interesting history of land trusts. Sally Fairfax has written a lot about it, as have others. But the primary tool of the land trust is the conservation easement. Once the development value of the land is removed, because it's got this easement on it, the value is lower and the landowner is eligible for a tax incentive. So that's one of the incentives that encourage private landowners to allow or sell or donate conservation easements on their land. So land trusts are basically a conservation institution. I've been thinking lately with a group of people about what are other types of conservation institutions that also integrate more justice-oriented aspects. So just kind of interested in, land trusts as a conservation institution, and then there's a whole other area of community land trusts, which typically will buy a set of properties in an urban area so that there's, affordable housing for people. So I'm just interested in where those meet, but that's a little bit of an aside. So land trusts are conservation institutions. They can acquire funds from public or private sources to purchase easements, or they will hold and manage and monitor easements. They might just facilitate a conservation transaction, make sure a property is sold in order to preserve it and purchased by a certain party that will preserve it. They do a lot of strategic planning. There are standards developed by, for example, Land Trust Alliance, but also for individual land trusts that guide the operation of land trusts. And then they're very active in the policy arena to make sure there are incentives for landowners to work with land trusts and or place easements on their lands. Native land trusts are similar but different because they focus on the cultural, the spiritual importance, the justice aspects, ensuring access to lands they may have been denied access to, but that are culturally important within their homelands. This again is Tasman-Koyam or Humbug Valley. This was at the ceremony in which the land transfer was celebrated last August, almost a year ago. And that's one of the structures put in the stream, some of the restoration work. I think that's actually not in Tasman, it's in a nearby valley. But really about fulfilling tribes' roles and responsibilities as stewards. And as I'll mention with the Native Land Trust Council, there's a vision of supporting the development of other Native land trusts. So this very much more cultural justice-oriented lens on conservation. And some of the different Native land trusts, some of their logos are here. And this is just a table, very basic table, listing some of the Native land trusts, the land status, mostly private land, the conservation tools used, easements, the land trust structure, just putting land in conservation ownership, all of the multiple partners, often agencies, sometimes academics, researchers, Native and non-Native land trusts, private foundations that fund this work, and then some of the amazing accomplishments, widespread access easements, implementation of restoration and stewardship, often using tribally led crews, receiving donations of land, diverse donations of land, developing educational programs, et cetera, lots of great accomplishments. The Native Land Trust Council we've been working on forming for a few years. I see that actually Julia Sizek is in this picture. She's a grad student in anthropology at UC Berkeley, and she has been working with the Kumeyaay De-colonial Land Conservancy for a number of years. So she was there at our meeting in 2017 at Agua Caliente. And the mission of this group is in a way akin to the Land Trust Alliance, a group of Native land trusts to support the development of additional Native land trusts with this particular cultural conservation and stewardship lens on land trusts and conservation. And here are a few more of the newer Native land trusts. Some of you may already be familiar with conservation easements. Easements are typically a grant of a right, to put a power line or put a road or access road across property. But a conservation easement is different. It prohibits an action, typically development, and it can also be affirmative, permitting or requiring certain actions like restoration or public access. The landowner continues to own the land as private property, but the easement holder holds a stick in the bundle of sticks that constitute the concept of property, and that is the right to prevent development. And they typically cross chain and title and are in perpetuity, although you could also have shorter term easements. The UCEA, the Uniform Conservation Easement Act, provides the blueprint for states as to what a conservation easement does and what it looks like. I highlight this cultural aspect here because even though it's the last element listed, it is still there. And I think that's important, that we're not only talking about conservation and biodiversity, but we're also talking about culture and people's relationships to place and caring for a place. So states have their own laws that enable conservation easements, and further, California had the first law to mandate tribal consultation at the local level. It's pretty specific around general plan amendments, but really the most important thing, or one of the most important things to me about Senate Bill 18 is that it establishes that tribes, non-recognized and recognized, can hold conservation easements. So that enables tribes to have a stake in ownership on properties within their homelands, specifically for stewardship, access, protection, etc. It also establishes that open space can be set aside specifically for the protection of California Native historical, cultural, and sacred sites. So it's a pretty important law. And Julia and I have been for a few years developing a project looking at how this has been implemented in different counties. So why would a tribe be interested, or why would a land trust or a native land trust be interested in engaging with easements? Because there can be this ability to have a stake in ownership on property within your homeland and then be able to restore and protect those areas. It can be a way to protect treaty rights. If you have a conservation, if a tribe or a native organization, a native land trust holds an easement on property that, say, a river runs through, can be a way to help maintain the health of the land for salmon or other migratory species. Some tribes have mitigated their development activities, both on and off reservation, with easements, or they have worked with other developers to hold easements and mitigate the impacts of the larger development on tribal lands, cultural and ecological resources. So there's lots of benefits, potential benefits to engaging with easements. Some examples of cooperative land acquisitions where easements or some type of protective conservation covenant are used. Here's one example from Alaska. In this example, a non-native land trust purchased the land, retained the conservation easement, but donated the land to the tribe. Somewhat similar here, TPL, Trust for Public Land, Coastal Conservancy, County, and other partners, including private funders, contributed funds to purchase property and then transfer it to Kashaya Pomo, who formed the Kashaya Coastal Reserve, the first coastal property this coastal Native nation had had in a century, so really important land transfer. And then up here, so I know some of you on here are familiar with this, Blue Creek, the salmon sanctuary. This land is owned by the Yurok tribe, or will be owned by the Yurok tribe, with conservation covenants that are held by Western Rivers Conservancy. So really important land transfer, land reacquisition for the tribe in collaboration with multiple other partners, including this non-native conservation entity. So there's a lot of opportunity with these collaborations for conservation to transfer land back to tribes. Cultural conservation easements, a little bit different than conservation easements because they focus and highlight stewardship, the cultural importance of place, and perpetuating culture on the land. And how do you manage the land to ensure that that can take place, that the land is protected, that people can access it for ceremonial use, that the land is stewarded such that these types of activities can take place on the land. And it's a stick in the bundle of sticks of property ownership that emphasizes both culture and conservation. And this is an example. Now there are many, many more. This is kind of an older example that I used in the text. And the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa were among the first to really articulate and put out there the concept of a cultural conservation easement. And the former chairman talked to me about an area, thinking of property and an area of property or land where a ceremony might take place. And the cultural easement, he said, was a property right to hold a ceremony, which I thought was really powerful and interesting. Now, many of the native land trusts that I collaborate with, they think of each of their conservation easements as always a cultural conservation easement because the ecology, the culture, they can't really be separated. This was one of the first easements, again, articulated as a cultural conservation easement in California, negotiated under Senate Bill 18, co-held by two tribes, really foregrounding the cultural values of the land. And this is outside of Vallejo. not named after that site, but not related to that particular easement, the Sogorea-Te Land Trust is a really important and different model of a native land trust, urban Indigenous women-led land trust right there in the East Bay, very active in Berkeley, working to protect sites, as well as in Oakland, facilitating return of Chukchenyo and Karkin Ohlone lands to Indigenous stewardship, very collaborative opportunities for all people to work together to re-envision the Bay Area community, what it means to live on Ohlone land. Karina Gould, who's leader with the Sogorea-Te Land Trust, was just featured on a ABC series. I can provide the link, really quite powerful, about native land and the lack of recognition of native land in urban areas in particular. And they really foreground healing. And part of that healing is land restoration and land return. And Karina, I think, has a powerful way of talking about cultural easements and land trusts, places to practice cultural belief systems, protect sacred places, have a voice over what happens on that land. We are the original caretakers of that land. And again, the power of the easement to have a say in what happens on land. And in the background is land, Sogorea-Te Land Trust holds in collaboration with Planting Justice in East Oakland. So just quickly, some of the opportunities: the long-term orientation of easements crossing property ownership facilitates stewardship and perpetuation, cultural perpetuation over generations. There's funding available for conservation. It was, when we first started talking about it, it was almost a backdoor way to think about supporting cultural stewardship and more justice-oriented interests on land. But with cultural conservation easements, that's really been foregrounded. Some of the challenges are, say you're a tribal organization or a tribe, if you are acquiring land and a non-native conservation entity, a non-native land trust holds the easement, then there's a relationship in which there's some enforcement, which impacts sovereignty, can be considered to be infringing on sovereignty. So that's a challenge that I think has been worked out on a case-by-case basis, what tribes and collaborators are comfortable with in the agreements for conservation easements. So a quick summary: lots of opportunities for education. I have students engaged in different applied projects and doing research with native land trusts, or in terms of looking at how these legal tools can be used. From a policy question or perspective, what are the opportunities for achieving tribal goals with the existing laws? And what are the challenges, and where can we push to make change to expand opportunities for tribal land restitution and restoration? And then finally, I'll touch on conservation policy. I think I'm doing pretty well on time here. I have that image there from the Yurok Tribe Salmon Festival last year. They did not have it this year due to COVID, but last year they had this really powerful logo showing the dams coming down, and it says, "Can't wait for tomorrow." As some of you may know, there's been a bit of a hiccup in the dam removal process. I'm hoping that will be able to be addressed soon. But there are opportunities I see for engaging in native land restitution and restoration through hydropower relicensing, when these dams come up for relicensing every 30 to 50 years, through settlements that require conservation, through dam removal processes, which I'm hoping will be one of my next big projects, is looking at tribal collaboration in dam removal processes throughout the West. And then also carbon offset protocols and opportunities. So I'll just touch briefly on just two of these today. The Stewardship Council, some of you may be familiar with this. Pacific Gas and Electric went through bankruptcy proceedings around the late 90s, beginning of the 2000s. They settled with the California Public Utilities Commission and determined that they would divest about either divest or put conservation restrictions on about 130,000 acres of watershed lands. So they stretch up and down the Sierras, and then there are a few in other parts of the state as well. So at the same time, I had been working with the Maidu Cultural and Development Group and the Maidu Summit to map the Indian allotment lands that were affected by many of these hydro projects. And I was focusing particularly in Plumas and Lassen counties, and particularly around the reservoirs. This is one of PG&E's reservoirs, two of them right here. And this book came out of that work. But what I was finding, which was of no surprise to people from there, but I just kind of documented it and put it all together into this map, is that lands that had been set aside for tribal members there were quickly canceled and transferred to the power company. This is from the Federal Archives. You know, the coordinates are crossed off and it says patented to Western Power Company, which was the predecessor company to Pacific Gas and Electric. The power company and the timber companies worked together quickly and profitably, and with the Bureau of Indian Affairs as well, to cancel these tribal lands here and then to begin building this dam, which became one of the larger facilities in PG&E's empire, I guess. And PG&E, before it was PG&E, was Great Western Power. They, you know, brought power to the city of San Francisco from the North Fork Feather River watershed. This is Lake Almanor, was Big Meadows within the Mountain Maidu homeland. And so again, these lands were canceled, transferred to the power company. They built a stairway of power, many dams in the Feather River Canyon. After a long period of study throughout much of the beginning of the 20th century, in the 50s and 60s, the state developed at that time the largest state water project in the world, or at least in the US. Well, they say world here. This is from the archives, the Water Resources Archives at UC Riverside. Establishing a dam here at Oroville, and then you know, controlling water, bringing water down through the delta all the way down south. So that's the beginning of the State Water Project. The dam at Oroville, salmon can't get past there. This is my son a few years ago watching the salmon try to get past. Pretty sad for sure in terms of the fact that salmon don't come up to the upper watershed anymore, have not for a number of years due to the hydropower and flood control facilities that were implemented on the North Fork Feather River. But one of the positive outcomes of this project, you know, along with tribal members and years of advocacy, was supporting this settlement and the return of Tasmamkoyam, or Humbug Valley, to the Maidu Summit last year. So the Stewardship Council, and so I was just updating this with reference to their materials, their progress, and the Stewardship Council is the entity that was overseeing this conservation divestiture of PG&E lands. So about 40,000 acres have been donated, including to federal and state agencies, including UC, local agencies as well. About 8,000 acres have been recommended for transfer or already transferred to 3 tribes: Potter Valley Tribe, Pit River Tribe, and the Maidu Summit is not a tribe. There are tribes that are members of the summit, but it is an organization. So about 20% of the land is going to tribes, which is, I think, you know, still not enough, but a huge victory from where we started with the Stewardship Council not being very interested in or engaged with thinking about these lands as tribal lands. Much of the largest single portion goes to CAL FIRE, and then PG&E is retaining the vast majority of the lands, which is a source of consternation to some. Jane Braxton Little wrote a piece recently. She's a journalist, an environmental journalist, detailing the concerns about this. And so finally, just briefly, offsets as an area of interest. I'm hoping this will be another future project. I am very interested in how tribes are engaging with carbon offsets, particularly in California, particularly under forest projects. The first project on California's carbon market was with the Yurok tribe. There are several benefits. There's a financial incentive to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, opportunities for tribes to generate projects that meet tribal priorities. But some of the challenges deal with environmental justice, the actual impacts of these carbon sequestration projects, and then whether or not, even if they're tribal projects, if traditional stewardship can be implemented on those lands within the protocols. But so far, you know, I think we've seen some positive things. I'm currently working on a paper with a grad student about opportunities for recognizing the sequestration impacts of cultural burning in carbon offsets, as has been done in Australia. So a quick summary, there's lots of opportunities in terms of my teaching and work with students. From a policy perspective in conservation, what are the opportunities for Indigenous interventions? Beneficial use categories in water quality have been important for underscoring or calling for often higher standards of water quality that meet the subsistence context of many Native nations. So that's another interesting area. Okay, so just to conclude here, so there's a little time for questions. Some of the challenges in looking at land restoration and restitution in a conservation context with Indigenous peoples are particularly, I think people, particularly in the environmental field, have a hard time acknowledging racism and settler colonial violence in institutions, in very accepted institutions, and institutions where we feel that the goal is a positive in terms of conservation for all, but how have some people been left out of that process, and how has this process of conservation been built on or seizing the rights of First Nations in particular. So financial incentives and financial tools, how do you pay for these projects? How do you incentivize land transfers and restrictions on land in terms of easements that enable Indigenous access, stewardship, and control? And then sometimes lands are contaminated. Of course, traditional lands are contaminated by mining activities, by historic timber spraying and harvesting, some ongoing spraying. And so if there are to be land transfers or easements, recognition of tribal stewardship, and the land is contaminated, we have to have partnerships to contribute to cleanup that is acceptable, an acceptable form of cleanup or remediation to tribal partners. So just to sum, some of the creative tools in conservation law, policy, and practice that focus on, the justice around Indigenous histories and relationships to the land include land trusts and easements, the development of partnerships and co-managements, carbon offsets if they're used in a way that affirms Indigenous land rights and provides support for regaining Indigenous land title, and dam removal processes, and also other processes that address and remove impediments to Indigenous stewardship and survival. So that could also involve the institution of these broader beneficial use, recognition of beneficial uses on different water bodies throughout the state. So in terms of going forward, of course, dealing with colonization and then trying to approach decolonization is multifaceted. Many aspects must be involved. It's hard. It's unsettling in the deepest sense of the word, but yet necessary. And I call on all of us to think about actions, tools, and processes that facilitate land transfers, co-management agreements, payments for ecosystem services that focus on the positive impacts of Indigenous land stewardship, the use of easements more for a justice-oriented, culturally oriented purpose, and then education of our future conservation leaders to lay the groundwork for expanded co-management policy and practice. Thank you. I'll stop share so I can take any questions.
Thank you very much. We can take questions if you want to raise your hand or ask them in the chat. That's also okay.
Hi, Nancy.
Great talk. Thanks, Beth. I have a question. It's kind of a general question, if I can ask, or do you want us to write it down in chat?
Oh, that's good. Go ahead.
That was a really, really well done talk, and I really appreciated that you focused on the policy dimensions of all of this, and acknowledge that there are a lot of challenges that still exist, even in groups and among individuals who think that they're all on the same page, and they're not really. And I wonder if you could talk, if you would be willing to give any concrete examples about, in particular, and I was kind of remembering a talk that we had years ago by a Hoopa land manager who came down and showed a film that had been done about conservation activity on the Hoopa Reservation. And it was fantastic, but this thing that you mentioned, how oftentimes conservation law conflicts, or conservation practice and goals conflict, or are understood to conflict with the goals, because the goals of tribal conservation may be very, very different from the goals of more general ecosystem services kind of conservation might be. So I wonder if you had any, if you could also give.
The good thing with 4 is I can now split it up.
Pardon me? Is that something else?
Sorry, I muted somebody. I think there was some background noise.
Okay. Anyway, so I was wondering maybe if you would be willing to give us an example of something that really worked well and something that didn't, but that maybe you managed to work out, or the kinds of things that seem very intractable. Because I think all of these things, all the stuff that you talked about just now, they're so in stark relief these days. I mean, with all the other injustice that's coming to the fore and that we're becoming more able to talk about. So I think your examples are really important, and it would be great to learn some specifics from your experience, because you've really been at the forefront of this whole thing for a very long time.
Thank you, Nancy. Great to see you. So I think the Stewardship Council process comes to mind, and there's a lot more to understand about that process. But initially, and in some of the initial, the settlement agreement language, it's completely focused on conservation, and it was in response to fighting this issue that PG&E intended to sell off the lands that they were not directly using for hydropower production. And so there was a public outcry about, conserving these ecologically important lands. But what was not, and that is important, but what was not at the table was the history of these lands, which is really striking because they're for hydro development. And that was, I think, pretty lucrative. And so, there's a clear paper trail around the seizure of these lands and their development for hydro. And that really, I feel like the Stewardship Council really didn't want to hear that at the beginning. I mean, they said, this is a process that's about conservation. It's really not about justice. But tribal members kept coming to the table and saying, this process is about justice for us. These lands were taken, and we can show that specifically with the allotments. That's how I kind of came to focus on the allotments, because they provided the paper trail. But they themselves are, such a partial picture of tribal land stewardship and tribal land rights, because they're actually like government recognized small parcels to try to encourage people to live on private property. But nonetheless, it was a tool we could use. But over the course of like 10 years of or more of advocacy by Maidu Summit, which was really the group I worked with the most and followed of all the groups participating, the tribes participating in the process, there was one particular meeting in which I believe California Fish and Wildlife was vying for the land, and they could show that they had a big portfolio of land that they already held and managed for conservation. And the Stewardship Council was saying to the summit, well, where's your land? Saying, well, you took it, and the tables kind of turned from the Stewardship Council and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife saying, well, Fish and Wildlife could own the land because they have the experience in the portfolio, and maybe the summit can have an easement to come out there and harvest and let us know when you're coming and what you're doing and what plants you're using. And then new leadership came into Fish and Wildlife, and it was the same staff in the room, but a completely different conversation. In which they said, well, why doesn't the summit own the land? And we have the easement to come out and care for the fish in the creek. And it was a complete shift, I guess, showing the power of a shift in leadership as well as advocacy over a long period of time. But I think that kind of illustrates, you know, the conservation kind of view was a bit narrow, was very narrow at the beginning, really not wanting to engage with the history of the land and being kind of afraid of, well, what does this mean in terms of diluting our conservation purpose? I think it took a lot of relationship building and time out on the land together for some of the agency folks to really recognize, you know, the tribe's history, the tribe's contemporary presence, and what they wanted to see on the land.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
We have a question by Quirina. I don't know if you want to read it out loud or I can do it. I will do it. The question is, how do you enforce the consultation process with corporations like PG&E? Is there an agency we can go to with concerns or help to facilitate consultations?
That's a good question. So, I mean, the agency would be, I guess, the Native American Heritage Commission, but PG&E is a weird animal, but is kind of it is a private entity, right? So it depends on what money, what land is impacted by the process. You know, if any federal land or money is involved, there's, of course, you know, all the different laws that come into play, NEPA, National Historic Preservation Act. But if it's state law, the California Environmental Quality Act, that's where AB 52 comes into play, which did, you know, up until, I don't have the slide in front of me or the numbers, but I think it was up until 2015, they were, working with tribes seemed to equate with consulting with an archaeologist. It was with the AB 52 and the way that modified the California Environmental Quality Act that it recognizes tribal cultural knowledge, tribal cultural resources, and enables set-aside specifically for protection of tribal cultural resources, you know, and recognizes living tribal entities as experts on their own culture. So that is a powerful tool. I do think, though, you know, these laws are procedural. You asked about consultation, and there's the whole definition of consultation in Senate Bill 18. But in terms of enforcing, you know, there's a lot of folks who know about this, but I would think lawsuits, you know, are what you often see, like the Ketchon case. That's a powerful example, and that was even before AB 52 of this. In that case, it was, I think, oh gosh, it was a federal agency that was not consulting properly with the tribe, was pushing forward the solar projects. And they were able to draw on Section 106, and it was procedural, you know, requiring consultation to follow these steps. So I hate to mention the lawsuit aspect, but that is, you know, that is one tool in the toolbox to push for consultation. It's really difficult. You know, I had a slide where I just showed the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106. I was working with you know, my husband and some others to protect a site that was in the path of fire suppression activities on one of the big fires in Northern California. And it took quite a bit of work and recitation of the different statutes to advocate that the dozers take a different path. It was not necessary to go through this very important area, but it really took being at the table, making a coalition and providing information super fast in like 3 to 5 days in order to stop what would have been a, irreplaceable damage. So consultation is not without a struggle, as I'm sure you know. But thank you for that question. I hope I answered it well enough.
Thank you. I think Bernard has a question.
Thank you, Beth. That was an incredible presentation, very enlightening for me. I should tell you, my wife's half Hawaiian. She qualifies for native lands in Hawaii. You know, maybe if they open it up, I'll move there someday. I actually am really sympathetic to what you're saying. I wish I knew more about the native people's plight in California. I know more about Hawaii because I go over there and see it. It's just, I'm just amazed what is the mechanism for all these tribes and feds and state and landlord? How do they interact day to day? Do you guys have conference chats or send emails or call your lawyers or what? I mean, how do you do it?
That is a big question. And I think that I'm pretty sure there are some members online here of tribes in California who would also have thoughts on this question. You know, what I see is like, a lot of times it's out of necessity because a lot of the lands that are, you know, within the homelands of different tribes in California are out of their jurisdiction. So all sorts of activities might be happening, including polluting activities, you know, industrial management that are out of their direct control because they don't have jurisdiction over that land. So it's out of necessity that they're engaging with all these other parties that, you know, have authority over lands within their homelands. And sometimes those are, you know, I think really cooperative interactions. And sometimes they're very challenging to get the agencies to respect tribal knowledge and history and, you know, rights and responsibilities to their homelands.
Tough.
And the consultation piece that I think Karina asked about is a big part of that there are these legal requirements for agencies and private landowners through various processes to consult with tribes if their projects are going to impact you know, tribal cultural resources or culturally important lands. The law doesn't, you know, go far enough because consultation is required, but the outcomes of consultation can vary. As long as consultation takes place, you know, oftentimes development can go forward, sometimes with mitigation, sometimes not.
Wow. Unbelievable. Well, can I ask another one then? All right, might as well start getting a little controversial. What do you think about gambling?
Well, I think you must mean tribal gaming.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's been a really important tool actually for tribes to increase revenue and to gain more of a political voice. I mean, there's lots of challenges with gaming and the impacts it has maybe within a community on people's relationships to each other. Some folks like David Wilton, can't blank on his name, he's a wonderful scholar at University of Minnesota, he wrote a book called Dismemberment that relates impacts, you know, from gaming to disenrollment. But I think thank you so much. I think by and large, it's been really positive for increasing political voice and increasing the ability to purchase lands and to have, you know, funding to carry forward restoration projects.
Sure.
I see I got a couple requests for some links, so I'll try to get those on here before we stop. There's a question from Sasha. Are there any loopholes within the land grant universities for land rematriation? Well, that's what we'll be talking about tomorrow at the land grab forum. I see a question about repatriation.
Maybe someone who's not gone yet, I have a question. I actually wrote in, it's interesting, I wrote in rematriation based on your shirt, and the computer changed it twice to repatriation. Maybe that answers the question. just wondering if you're seeing more public engagement of women on the in the communities in these struggles than may have been the case in earlier days.
You know, that's a good question. I feel like women have always been at the forefront of these struggles,
Okay.
but you know, doing the research, you know, doing work on the land, but maybe they haven't been the public voice always. And you know, when I show the picture of the Native Land Trust Council, you see it's all male leaders, but there's a whole, you know, range of leadership in the Native Land Trust movement. And I think Sogorea Te Land Trust exemplifies that. And I love, you know, the way they talk about rematriating the land and Indigenous women's leadership. I think that's very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe kind of new, at least in the Native Land Trust field, or as Native Land Trusts are known, but I don't think it's new in terms of Native leadership in land stewardship and land access and activism for land.
Great. Thanks.
I think we have a hand from Ted Grantham.
Hi, thank you. Really enjoyed your talk. I'm curious, you talked about Native Land Trust and the conservation easement as a tool, and I'm curious to what extent sort of water, access to water, and negotiations over water rights are either sort of have been integrated in that process or exist outside of that process. I'm just curious if how these various strategies that you've outlined sort of intersect with issues with water access.
That's a really good question. And I think a couple things. One is that, you know, easements can be highly specific, conservation easements to the parcel, the process, the partners. And so I think it really depends. With the Stewardship Council lands and their conservation covenants and land transfers, I'm pretty sure that PG&E retains the water rights, which itself is interesting and problematic, and was kind of I think a deal breaker for some other tribes and others who were interested in participating in that process. But I don't know a lot about water rights in easements. That's a really good area of investigation, I think. And it pertains definitely to the use of easements for protecting species protected in treaties, such as salmon, for example. If you have easements on land along the waterway, you know, to make sure you have a good habitat and not, you know, pollution going from the land based on land management into the water, then you should have some role in terms of water rights. So I don't know. That's a great question.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. If there's no more pressing questions, I think we'll wrap it up. Remember that there's a social hour starting now. Emily Chen from the ESPM Social Committee sent the link today. So thank you, and please join me once again in thanking Professor Middleton for this very interesting talk today.
Thank you so much for your questions, and please feel free to email me if there was something I didn't get to.
Beth, I want to use your book in my class next semester. It's on land.
Oh, thanks, Nancy. Well, I look forward to hearing what you think of it.
Okay. It seemed like you had two that you put up covers for. Did I miss something?
Yeah, well,
was it somebody else's book that was up?
No, one is on land trusts and easements.
Yeah.
And the other one is on the history of the allotments and the State Water Project, the Stewardship Council process.
Yeah, that's what one I was thinking. That's my due stuff.
Yeah, that was so hard to write because it was like so much material and life in like a little book.
Yeah. Well, then it's a great example. Okay, good. So
yeah, I hope I get to work on the dam book, and you know, at some point we'll see. Go.
Okay, I will leave, but you can continue to chat. I will leave.
Albert, how do we get into the social hour later?
I think they sent an email that I don't organize.
Okay.
Emily Chen sent an email this morning.
Okay.
I think. Okay, thank you very much. This was very interesting. Yeah.
Thanks,
okay.
Beth. So yeah, maybe I'll